conducting 6 roundtable discussions, the first of which is around cybersecurity. And the purpose of it is to raise awareness of the important work of our Cybersecurity and Privacy Committee, which of course runs parallel to the ISO IEC JTC1 SC27 Cybersecurity Committee. So welcome to ITI, welcome to INCITS. And I am David Bain. I am your INCITS Executive Director. I have the privilege of leading a team of standards executives who are experts in the horizontal practice of standards development. But today we're going to hear from the experts. We have quite a distinguished panel, experts in the subject matter of cybersecurity. So let me just say a few brief thank yous and give you some housekeeping notes. Thank you to the people from ITI who helped to make this event possible, to help prepare. Siobhan Davis, Mia Harris, Ashley Barang, Christine Beck is driving the webinar for us today. Thank you, Christine. We no longer, by the way, say you're manning something because we're adopting much more inclusive language. And we have a standards committee for that as well, for inclusive language and technology. So also AJ Mahesh, thank you, AJ, for helping. Within ITI, we have a group of experts in cybersecurity who are true experts in cybersecurity policy and get much deeper into these issues. I thank them for their thoughts in helping me prepare for this event. Gordon Bitko, Rob Strayer, John Miller, Courtney Lang, Leopold Rubenauer, and Rhoda Washington, who is here with us in the room, responsible for state and local work, including the topic of cybersecurity. So, committee chairs and committee officers in our cybersecurity committee. I just want to give you a quick shout out as well. Eric, of course, is one of our panelists, Eric Hibbard. John Britton from Google is the vice chair. Thomas Rivera from VMware, Nadia Bartol from Boston Consulting Group are also officers. And the committee manager for the INCITS Cybersecurity and Privacy Committee is Kim Quigley. So thank you, Kim. And last but not least, our fellow Standards Advancement Fellow for this summer, whom many of you may have met on the way up, Zamalan Mukhtaral is to be thanked, as well as Jennifer Garner and Lynn Barra. So a few housekeeping announcements. The room that you're in, if you're here with us, has microphones all over the place. So when you have a question, I encourage you to write down your questions, because this is a true roundtable discussion. All you have to do is speak up a little bit, and we have that luxury. Unfortunately, the microphones also come with the responsibility to keep quiet, keep our devices quiet, and any side conversations could also be picked up. So I give you that fair warning. Our discussion is on the record. However, it is not a meeting of a working meeting of the Cyber Standards Committee, and it's not considered a meeting of record for the committee itself. And unless otherwise specifically noted, we take it as a given that everyone's comments will be considered their own personal views and not representing the views or positions of their respective organizations, right? So the bios are in the program. If you're part of our virtual audience, you received a reminder over Zoom, you probably could scroll down to the bottom of that reminder and see the impressive bios of our panelists. One of our panelists is still en route. Admiral Rogers notified us that he is stuck in traffic a little bit, and we're just dispensing with the initial announcements and hope that he will be joining us soon enough. So this event is what we sometimes not so affectionately refer to as a double hybrid event, meaning that our audience is both split between the virtual and the in-person, as well as our panelists. We have two panelists who are remote for us. AJ, would you mind catching? I think somebody's trying to join us here. And so let's just dive in. But I would also like to thank everyone who is in attendance, because let's face it, this is a Friday afternoon, and I think it's a testament to the gravity of this subject, and you know, that everyone is participating in including our virtual audience. We thank you for that. So if you are virtual, do write down your questions, and there is a functionality that you will be able to submit your question, and I'll receive it here toward the end of our program. We'll get to as many questions as we can. So let's kick things off. I'd like to start with our virtual panelists. Laura Lindsay from Microsoft is the chair of INCITS, and is a longstanding figure, not just in the leadership of INCITS as a standards organization, but specifically has leadership roles in cybersecurity. So welcome, Laura. Can you hear us?
I can hear you well. Hopefully you can all hear me.
Affirmative.
Excellent. So just a brief introduction in case you didn't get a chance to read the bio. My name is Laura Lindsay. I work at Microsoft in the corporate standards group, and my focus really is on cybersecurity related standards. I've been doing that for the last 15 to 20 years. And in the last 4 years, I have actually been the vice chair of the organization in ISO IEC JTC1 SC27 that does cybersecurity, information security, and privacy protection. So I have a lot of background in the standards that are being done, and a lot of interest in making sure that we're leveraging those international standards. Thank you.
Well, Laura, why don't you tell us then, what do you view as the role of the INCITS Cybersecurity and Privacy Committee, and how exactly does it fit in to ISO IEC JTC1 SC27, and for that matter, how does the 27,000 series of standards fit into the world's patchwork of cybersecurity standards?
So I might be stealing a little bit of Eric's thunder here, but the INCITS Cybersecurity and Privacy Technical Committee is the U.S. representation for representing the U.S. into SC27. So any of the members that are participating there get to they're participating and helping set what the U.S. positions are into all of the SC20, what we shorten to SC27 standards. Some of those standards include the one you just mentioned, which is 27,000, the 27,000 series, which includes, probably the most well-known is the ISO IEC 27001, which is the Information Security Management System. And this has been a standard that has set the bar for, you know, if you're going to go and talk to people about, does my organization do information security, this is the minimum bar you have to meet. If you haven't done ISO 27001, then most people are saying, okay, you haven't looked at cybersecurity yet. So it really is that opening step, and it talks about how an organization puts together a information security management system, what the requirements are. And one of the key parts that then is a risk assessment that then goes and says, once you've done that risk assessment, you need to define which controls you need to meet. And that's what ISO IEC 27002 is the implementation guidance really around, or the guidance around what those sets of controls may be. So another example of that might be that you look at the ISO IEC 27002 guidance. But you might also, here in the US, you might also, when you're looking at what NIST is doing, you might also look at the NIST 853 controls, which are very similar, and look at how you match those up. And so a lot of what we see is these different control sets that people are mapping together and how they work together. And then you add on top of that how the cybersecurity frame, the NIST cybersecurity framework was built. We've taken that into SC 27 as well. And we've actually formulated a standard on how to build a cybersecurity framework in ISO IEC 27110. So we're really taking what we've learned as best practices here in the US, going through the INCITS Cybersecurity and Privacy Committee, taking that to SC 27 and helping raise the bar globally.
And while we have you, can you also tell us how cybersecurity as a standards area might be different from other standards that we have committees for in INCITS? Because they're all different committees that you have a special overview of as chair. Quantum computing, artificial intelligence, just to name a couple of over 40.
So cybersecurity is unique in that it really is what we like to call a cross-domain or a cross-cutting type of technology area, where when you talk about AI, you have to consider what are the cybersecurity and the privacy impacts that AI is going to bring. Or if you're going to talk about quantum computing, one of the things we talk about is, what about post-quantum cryptography? And SC 27, again, the cybersecurity committee there is looking already at what are some of the post-quantum cryptography types of issues you're going to have to look at, and what are the hurdles you're going to have to make for that. And that ties back to then the quantum computing working group that's also in JTC1. So the thing about cybersecurity that, and you could say cybersecurity and privacy together, is unique, is that it's very much a cross domain, or it touches on everything. It's part of a little piece of everything. So what you see happening in SC 27 are these what we call foundational types of standards that talk about, here's what you need to be thinking about as you do your AI, or as you do your IoT. You need to be thinking about the basics for cybersecurity, and then there may be a touch more that you need to do that are unique specifically to that area, and we touch on that instead. The other one is, it also crosses into other areas that aren't strictly technology, but also think about your healthcare, your finance. Cybersecurity touches on all of these. And so it's important to not just what the technology is, but how it's applied in different verticals as well as in different technologies.
Thank you for that answer. And I'm so glad that you bring up quantum as it relates to this area, because spoiler alert, I will be presenting our panelists in person here today with a quantum secure analog storage appliance at the end of the program. So, Eric Hibbard.
Yes.
Let's move on to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'd like to ask you, since you have uniquely long-standing service across multiple SDOs and for different organizations, if you could share with us the types of organizations that participate in cybersecurity standards leadership and why they do it. What are the benefits to those organizations and to their subject matter experts for their investment of their personnel and time in this thing that you have dedicated so much of your career to?
Yeah, it's definitely multifaceted, and I would say from a US perspective, might even actually be different than many other countries. What we see in the US are a lot of multinational organizations, so companies that actually have to work in 2, 3, maybe more jurisdictions. And so, especially with international standards, that can help significantly sort of, get control of sort of your business setting, if you will. we see that companies who are, again, from a US perspective, heavily involved with the US government. So we see different elements of the US government participating, but we also see organizations that are directly supporting those. That allows for some interesting dynamics, because there's some play between, and Laura sort of alluded to this with the cybersecurity framework, where something will be originated in the US, and then there's some dialogue that will take place with maybe the private sector. And if it looks like this has, much broader appeal or use, then we will end up injecting it as part of the representation for the US into the ISO arena. So organizations that want to participate in that kind of vetting, that dialogue, will typically engage in the standard space. As Laura pointed out, cybersecurity and privacy are both cross-cutting. So I like to think of security as being kind of the crow's nest. So if you want to know what's going on, where are the areas of concern, then watching what's happening in both of those arenas can serve as an early warning in terms of, oh, we're going to have to worry about this at some point. If you're just paranoid, and I'm a paranoid security person, you want to know, potentially what your competitors are doing. You want to know, and if you've seen my bio, you see I do some work with the American Bar Association, and I'm not a lawyer. I want to know what interests the legal community, because if it's interesting them, it may or may not be in my best interest if I don't have my act together. So the concept of reasonable security, what is that? And I like to joke about something of that being, what is a good New York lawyer able to argue is reasonable security? But in many ways, what we're trying to do with the standards is to set that bar. And a facet that Laura didn't highlight, it was implied, is one of the differences with cybersecurity in particular is it's not a one and done kind of issue. We are dealing with a set of actors who have malicious intent. They're well educated, well funded, highly motivated. And every step we take, they take two to counter us. And so we're never done with what we're doing. And so in many cases, some of the technology areas that we work with, we team with, they think they're done until we show up and say, oh, did you know that there's this new interesting exploit that we've found? And you're going to need to adjust from a technology perspective to sort of counter that. So anybody that's interested in sort of that lay of the land, which is quite broad, is a potential participant, or at least an observer to see what's in the pipeline for them.
And what are the categories? Obviously, the leadership of some of the world's leading technology companies are serving with you, shoulder to shoulder on these committees. But what are the other categories that are eligible for participation, and who's are there stakeholders whose perspective might be better represented when you look around the meeting?
Excellent question. So one of the groups that I find very interesting is we actually have several small entities that are participating. Many of those will serve in consulting roles, and they see the value of simply participating in the organization. It helps position them, saying, not only do I know the standards, I'm engaged in their development. So that's a facet. We see, and I'm sorry, I have lots of letters after my name, and it's occupational hazard. Simply maintaining those certifications, participation in this particular committee, the Cybersecurity and Privacy Committee, can actually be helpful to do the constant requalifications that we have to basically do. I would say, in terms of from a US perspective, who's missing? We really have a limited participation of academia. And that's noteworthy because in Europe, we see in many cases almost the opposite of what we're doing. We have a lot in the US, a lot of practitioners, not so much academia. And in Europe, we've, and Laura and I have lots of scar tissue on that, dealing with academia who have never actually set foot in the field, pontificating about how one should, defend yourself. And, there's some interesting dynamics. So the US is very strong in terms of real life situations, but there are some some valuable inputs from the research side in academia. And that's an area that we're definitely trying to improve, interactions with the Cybersecurity and Privacy Technical Committee.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Chris. Chris Lovejoy, we want to welcome you and congratulate you and Kendrell for being the newest member of ITI. People in the world may not realize, but ITI, the parent organization of INCITS, has a membership cap of 80 members. And when one member rolls off, there's a scramble for who gets the open spot. So congratulations.
So you literally stepped over someone's dead body. Is that what we're going to do?
And here's your question. We talk about the digital transformation, the acceleration in digital transformation that took place with COVID. Some say the USA has been pushed forward by 10 years in a hasty effort to bring things digital. And is this transformation partially to blame for an uptick in vulnerabilities within cloud infrastructure, APIs, web apps, and microservices? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, with this overwhelming challenge, how have organizations grappled with the shortage of talent to address this situation? That many organizations find themselves in with a greater attack surface to defend and really increased reliance on the digital infrastructure.
Very good. Keep that both in mind. So just a step back, let me explain what Kyndryl is for those of you who don't know. Kyndryl is the other half of IBM, better half. So IBM is split into two parts. And so we are now one of the largest IT outsourcing and services providers in the world. We operate in 130 countries. My role within Kyndryl is really, I have two hats. One is I'm responsible for commercial security. So it's more of an inward facing role where I'm looking at the shared infrastructure upon which we're delivering our services, as well as the dedicated infrastructure that we run on behalf of our clients. So I'm responsible for the implementation of the controls to maintain, level of security and resiliency. Second role is building and delivering security and resiliency services. So one of the things that is, we've actually put our security, business continuity, disaster recovery into one bucket. And we've actually developed a new cyber resiliency framework in and around that area. Why is that important? Because a lot of the regs today are really focusing on resiliency, something I want to bring up as we sort of talk about this. But suffice to say, my job is to really think about and offer the care and feeding for that portfolio. And it's big. We are, right now we're about 10,000 people, and we are the largest provider of recovery services, which means that when there is a breach, it's not that we're responding, we're coming in rebuilding the system. So we're seeing a lot of what's actually happening out there. As far as the question, yes, there has been an exorbitant amount of digital innovation that has taken place over the past, X number of years during the COVID period. It's not just here in the US, it's all over the place. And what we're seeing is that a lot of that innovation happened with limited security control. So statistically speaking, it is assumed that 60% of the world integrated new technology to enable work from home or to enable new works with clients. Of that 60% either abbreviated or completely skipped over the implementation of security control around that technology. So what is the result? The end result is massively expanded attack surface. So you've got an expanded attack surface, you've got sophisticated attackers. So yes, what we are seeing is a definite increase in the number of events, particularly ransomware related events that are impacting our customers. Now, on the subject of, I do want to take a little bit of a different spin on this though, because I think it's important for why we're in this room talking about international standards. At the same time, there has been this kind of energetic move toward new technologies. There has also been a significant balkanization in regulation in and around privacy and security. So if you look at the ITU map of mature and growing countries, most of those countries, it's like 70 countries, have introduced new legislation in and around privacy, data localization, data residency, and or digital sovereignty. Now, this is a significant issue because each one of these laws differs. So if you go to Vietnam, you go to, you name it, you just pick a country, the interpretation of that set of rules is going to differ country by country. Now, I am responsible for navigating 130 different countries. I'm responsible for doing that on behalf of our clients. I can tell you, it is hard. And what is really happening and impacting a lot of organizations, particularly in the emerging nations, is they're finding it very hard to compete. And so what we're seeing is multinational organizations are pulling out of some of the emerging countries because they can't afford to compete in these particular areas. And what we're seeing is some of our adversaries are taking advantage of our absence, and they're beginning to sort of find themselves within these areas. Now, why is this important? It's important because the balkanization of our approaches to regulation, it's a problem. It's a problem for the world. The only answer is really international standards. And it's not just the international standard, it's the advocacy around that international standard. And so one of the reasons why I'm happy to be here is because it's a subject I'm very passionate about. I think this institution in particular has an important role in providing some basic framework for organizations upon which they can apply. Because we are beginning to see, I mean, personally, I'm looking at things like food sustainability, particularly in and around rare earth metals, and looking at things like just rare earth metals and sort of using renewable energy sources, et cetera. The countries that are being hurt are the producers of those metals. So we all have to think about how are some of the actions that we're taking and the lack of focus on international standards, how is this from a long game perspective going to impact the US economic competitiveness, or give rise to allow for some of our adversaries to get better access to certain markets where things like rare earth metals are being produced. Anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, but I did want to just make sure I was taking that little bit of a left turn.
Thank you. I congratulated you on joining ITI. I think I need to congratulate ITI in getting Kyndryl, because you have a powerful vision, a powerful perspective that we're so glad to have you with us now. Are you ready?
Next up, come on.
Are you ready for a question?
Let's do it.
So yes.
Nothing like driving down from Philadelphia on a Friday afternoon.
I got to tell you, when the crazy idea of having this panel happened, the thing that made our stone soup was your
Sure, come on, this is the expertise.
So let me throw a question at you. On February,
Sixth game of the 1959 World Series. No, that's not it.
that's
Damn
not
it.
it. On February 24th,
Asian.
yes, Alaska's junior senator Dan Sullivan said that there is a broader implication of Russia's invasion, and he called it a start of an era of authoritarian aggression, specifically referring to Russia. Maybe other countries that are sort of sitting on two seats at the moment, trying to figure out which camp they will fall into in the future. We'll see. But the question is, do you agree with this assessment? And do you see unbridled aggression manifesting itself in the cyber domain Chris Krebs, former head of CISA.
Good friend.
He has said that he didn't expect to see an uptick in activity. Why? Because they were already attacking our institutions, full tilt. What's your take on that?
First, I would remind everybody that the February 2022 Russian invasion of the Ukraine is the third incursion that the Russians have done against a neighbor. 2008, Georgia, 2014, Crimea, 2022, broader segment of Ukraine. So I always encourage people, could you spend a little time thinking about history? This is not an isolated example. This is but the latest in a trend that we have seen in a Putin-led Russia. This idea that armed invasion into countries on the periphery in the name of Russian national security interest is somehow legitimate. And he's always maintained that, and the rest of the world, quite rightfully, rejects that premise. Except China, arguably, that the sovereignty is a different definition in their mind. With respect to cyber activity associated with the conflict, I always remind people first, there's a lot of activity going on. Part of this is we got to change our definition. We generally tend to assume the definition of significant cyber activity is equated with catastrophic impact or failure. So because we haven't seen catastrophic impact or failure, a lot of people are going, there's not much going on here. The Russians really aren't. And I'm going, guys, if you look at the breadth of activity that's ongoing, there is a lot of cyber activity ongoing. There's a lot of attempted intrusions on the part of the Russians, both in Ukraine, and you also saw activity prior to the event, not at a massive scale, I wouldn't pretend that, but there's a lot more cyber activity going on than we give people credit. The reason we didn't see more in some ways to me is, number one, I think the Russians' view was, just as we saw on the ground and the air environments, they felt they didn't need it. Their going in position was, this is going to be over relatively quickly. We don't really need it. Why would we want to potentially use cyber as a tool to cause damage to the very infrastructure we are going to need to use once we assume control of a significant part of Ukraine? Remember, the Russians are going to need to use that internet structure, that Wi-Fi structure. They were going to need to use this to execute the mechanisms of governance and control of a population. And so I think their view was they didn't need it. Secondly, I think, as I said, they didn't want to hurt the infrastructure. And thirdly, I think they also felt, in terms of outside Ukraine, look, we don't want to broaden this conflict. And so I think they felt they should be very measured with respect to cyber. I think it also highlights one of their strengths and one of their weaknesses. Their strengths is a guy who defended against them and also, quite frankly, penetrated them for a lot of years. Their strengths always were static campaigns against low to moderately prepared networks that did not have a high rate of dynamic change. That tended to be what they were really good at. As an individual who has penetrated networks for a living, I would tell you it takes weeks and months to execute a well laid out penetration attempts. I mean, this is not something you do in the course of a day. You spend a lot of time thinking about what's your objective, what's the methodology, and how do you get in without being detected to the maximum extent that you can. What we're seeing in Ukraine now, to me, is where they don't do well is in rapidly changing environments with a high rate of change against networks with a high level of preparation and a very dynamic approach to cybersecurity. And they are really having challenges doing that in Ukraine. And again, you see the same thing I would argue in the ground and the air. They are not excelling in static dynamic situations. They tend to like the prodding static, we'll apply overwhelming force and we'll just drive our way through it. I think you also have to give Ukraine credit, and then I'll shut up. To me, there's a lot of interesting things to take from a cyber perspective from this conflict. For the first time, literally, you are seeing the two primary combatants, Russia and Ukraine, literally crowdsource cyber offense and cyber defense. You've never seen a nation state do that before. Each side has literally said to themselves, we do not have enough capacity, we do not have an expertise both defensively and offensively, and have said, therefore, we need to ask ourselves, how do we augment that capability, that capacity? In the case of the Russians, they clearly have turned to the criminal element, as well as capabilities with within their own society to say, join our patriotic structure of hackers and defenders. We need assistance. Ukraine, number one, you got to give them credit for the last 8 years. They clearly have spent a lot of time since Crimea focused on generating more resilience, both in cyber, but I would argue more broadly as a society. We probably didn't recognize the level of effort they had put into this, and quite frankly, how good they had been at it. You got to give Ukraine a lot of credit at many levels. I think also Ukraine, interestingly, they took the Russian model one better. They not only went to their own citizens and their own private sector and said, we need more capacity. They went to the broader world around them and said, who wants to help us both offensively and defensively? And unlike the Russians, they have managed to get the private sector around the rest of the world in cybersecurity to aggressively team with them. Microsoft, CrowdStrike, etc. They are not assisting the Russians, but they are assisting Ukraine. That has created a really dynamic cybersecurity environment in which there is a high degree of integration, a high degree of coordination, and a high level of change on a regular basis that is really causing the Russians a lot of challenges. We'll have to see over time, does this current desire, it appears, to not escalate, does that change? Do they feel over time perhaps they need to, if they find themselves not achieving the objectives they set for themselves, if they feel they need to put pressure on the West, if they feel they need to create a political dynamic where the citizens of the nations that are executing these sanction regimes are starting to put pressure on their governments to say, hey, look, I didn't sign up to supply chain disruption. I didn't sign up to disruption in energy, fuel, finance. I didn't sign up to this kind of inflation and cost increase. We'll have to see over time how resilient does the coalition prove to be, but you got to give it credit so far. We're about 135 days into this. And I think we're certainly in a situation that most people had not predicted. The Russians, while they have achieved some measure of gain, I think right now they have like 22-25% of Ukraine's territory under their control. That is not what I think most people thought on February the 24th, the way this was going to play out, or that we would still, over 4 months into this, we'd still be in a major campaign with multiple elements, ground, air, cyber.
Thank you. Let's get Andrew into this conversation. Andrew, you're the head of 5G and XG at MITRE, which also enjoys, like INCITS itself, enjoys a close partnership with many federal executive agencies. But more than that, you have a long history of government service. You know, how do you see what have you seen in standards development that speaks to this whole great power competition?
It's been very interesting. Like as an example, a lot of my standards development experience sits inside of 3GPP, right? The organization principally responsible for the development of LTE and 5G. When I first started leading the FirstNet standards team back in 2012, and you looked at participation, so 3GPP is a regional partnership, right? Made up of a bunch of different regional SDOs. China has one, CCSA. China's participation, I think back in 2012, had about 30 organizations. If you fast forward 9 years, I think the last time I looked at it, I think there were more than 180. And so the growth, right, of Chinese participation in standards development fora has been massive when you compare that to what you've seen from Western countries.
And how do they fund CPSA within China?
Well, the CCSA's, it's hard to say that any organization in China is completely detached from the government. Even in business school, right, learning to do business in China, you set the expectation some member of the party was going to be part of any organization's board, right, in order to actually operate inside of China. So the connection, I think, between the Chinese government and any Chinese apparatus based there is definitive. And the CCSA as an organization has done stuff advocating for their people to be elected into leadership positions in these organizations and tactfully removing US companies from email distribution lists, even though they were members of CCSA, to try to promote their people. We've seen senior government officials show up at meetings and have breakfast with all the China nationals right the day before an election, right, to try to make sure that everybody was going to vote the right way. We've seen organizations, from any one particular region, especially China, come in with a unified position where, pre-standards coordination, right, was clear, where Western companies don't and can't do that. And so, so that's one mode that we've seen, right? Both the massive increase in participation and then the methods, that they use to try to gain leadership positions is interesting. And one thing I heard a lot, especially when I was in government, was, well, it's a consensus-based organization. There are processes and procedures that prevent any one organization from abusing, the consensus-based nature of these organizations. Any process can be abused, right? And certainly I saw stuff in 3GPP that was questionable. Not that that there was a process violation, but manipulation of the process, right, in their favor. And they take it's a multimodal approach, right? At the same time, we were seeing some of this stuff happen in 3GPP. The topics that China was looking at, software-defined networking, AI, ML, certainly their interest in 5G, and launching an effort within the ITU called New IP to try to wrest control of how the internet is standardized from the IETF into ITU-T instead of groups 11 and 13. And to the point that Chris made earlier, these were places where not a whole lot of Western participation, right? There was an absence of Western leadership in some of these places. And these developing economies that Chris mentioned, right, oftentimes turn to the ITU, lacking a domestic standards development capability of their own, and require their industries to leverage ITU standards in the absence of a domestic one. And so China's got a good long vision, right? They have a 2035 standard strategy. They get into the ITU and start to try to move topics like this into a place where if they can develop a standard, even if it's vaporware, these countries might actually have to end up leveraging it based on their own laws. And then they get inside these developing economies and do things like fully subsidized 5G systems. And oh, by the way, here's a soccer stadium along with it. And all we need in return is all your mineral resources, and we want to build a port. And so that kind of multimodal approach to standards development and flooding SDOs with participants, being able to doing it from an authoritarian or autocratic perspective, where none of our organizations can take that similar approach. And so it's a little bit of a fiction to believe that all is well in standards as long as you have a consensus-based environment, if only because state-sponsored organizations do go forest shopping, and they can be successful, right, when they find places where we're not.
So it's one thing to criticize the management paradigm of their particular way of handling public-private partnership, if you want to call it that. It's another thing for us to not abdicate the space. But what can we do about it? How can we and our circle of friends and allies and future allies, how can we up our game?
It's hard because one of the, again, running back to my experience in 3GPP, we saw a lot of small organizations try to participate in 3GPP, and the learning curve in an organization like that is incredibly steep. The resources, right, to run a real standards game in that organization is tremendous. We managed to succeed with 8 full-time people, right, from originally with the FirstNet standards team, but you see, whether it's even like our organizations, Qualcomm, sending dozens of people, right, to AT&T, dozens of people, right, Nokia, Huawei, Ericsson, right, all leveraging many people. But what we need to do is we need to see small and medium-sized companies more, participating more in these organizations, but they always have a hard time figuring out the return on investment, right? If you're not getting those standards essential patents put into the standards, you're not going to generate revenue from it, and it's one of the first things that's going to get cut off a budget if you're not doing well. And so, having the government look at what are the tools that it has, where it obviously isn't going to, outplay, out China in their playbook when it comes to how they do standards. So we have to look at how we incentivize, based on our own kind of Western values, getting those organizations to participate and generate that ROI. And so things like you see out of, what's going on right now with the USICA bill and the House Competes bill, where, there's bits and portions of standard subsidization for small companies sitting inside some of those bills where you might actually be able to maybe do tax write-ups for participation in standards. right? Or find other ways, right, to bring that ROI more to the front of mind of some companies and make it easier to do. But again, it's hard because we can't take the same page, out of China's playbook and expect to be successful.
I hear what you're saying. It seems that so much of the federal PPP, public-private partnership cooperation is around incident response, and maybe not enough of it is on the longer term. We see this not just as a sprint, but particularly in the standards world, it's a marathon. And we're always thinking of ways to bring more stakeholders to the table.
I remember, in fairness to China, they looked at the success of the West in creating the standards for the global technologies to shape the 20th century. So their view is, hey, we're going to outcompete them. We'll turn the tide against them. So, in fairness, they're looking at something that they've seen before.
And they're also not doing anything that's against any of their domestic policies or laws, right? I mean, everything that they do is within the boundaries of something that they find acceptable, where our laws and policies don't allow for the same type of participation or pre-standards coordination.
That's right. So I do want to save the last 10 minutes for your questions, but I want to make sure we get a couple of things in. We brought up quantum earlier, talking and actually it was just this week on July 5th, NIST. Mike Hogan, thank you for being here from NIST. Is nodding his head. NIST announced its winners of the 6-year contest in algorithms that are post-quantum sufficient. And I think,
Remember, in fairness, the initial winners, the implication being, hey, there's a follow-on sequence to this.
indeed. Well, Admiral Rogers, can you tell us how serious and how imminent do you consider this quantum threat, the threat that information will be intercepted and encrypted information will be intercepted and decoded in real time, or for that matter, intercepted, stored to a future date at which it may still have the information may still have an intelligence value.
So first, I try to remind people that quantum represents not just threat, but opportunity. So let's not just tell ourselves that this is only about threat. There's great opportunity for societies, our own, as well as the broader global community. Look, what quantum enables you to do, it's not unlike classic computation, which is inherently bounded by the thing we call the byte, which is only 2 variables, and it can only do 1 variable at times. It takes the hardest problem sets, massive data, lots of variables, and a high rate of change. Classic computation does not do well against that, which is why it hasn't been strong enough to deal with commercial grade encryption, for example. Quantum, on the other hand, if we can get, the qubit, the equivalent of the byte, if we can get qubit structures to be stable to the hundreds of thousands or the millions, we potentially now, with the amount of variables that you can look at simultaneously and the computational capability, that suddenly starts to make current commercial encryption much more challenged. And the ability to actually power through in a relatively reasonable short period of time compared to where we are now. Now, there clearly is a strategy ongoing on the part of China and others to build a data link that's going to help in part of this challenge to get to a qubit stability where we can get literally millions, if not hundreds of thousands of qubits. We're probably some number of years away, but in my own experience, I first started dealing with quantum as the director of NSA 2008. We started putting money against the problem and trying to ask ourselves, hey, look, what do we need to do to ensure our nation is positioned to deal with this? And I remember in 2008, we said to ourselves, I remember taking my first brief from the team. I said, okay, so what time frame are we looking at? The team said, hey, sir, this is probably a 30 to 35 year problem set. So now it's in 2008. Now I would tell you in 2022, hey guys, we're probably looking at something much closer than a 5 to 7 year problem set for advanced computational capability. So this is something that's going to happen in the near term, which is why NIST and others have been so focused on, look, we have got to create quantum resistant cryptographic capability, and that starts with the algorithms that we build around. So it's something we need to position ourselves for, but I also try to remind people, look, don't forget the opportunity this represents as well, and there will be both defensive as well as offensive implications to it. Let's not forget that there's two sides of the coin here.
Nonetheless, 2008, I gotta say, you might have a country song there. I was quantum when quantum wasn't
Well,
cool.
I don't know, I wouldn't say that. I remember thinking to myself, yeah, well, I'm not gonna be around here in 30 to 35 years.
Well,
Not that matter.
you are
Not that old.
you are a young retiree, I must say. And if you'll permit me, I want to ask you a quasi-personal question about, this moment in the country's history. We kind of need leaders who simultaneously possess a deep knowledge of our adversaries and still have the, operational expertise to command organizations and have some capacity to bridge partisan divides. I learned from your Wikipedia page that you're staunchly nonpartisan,
Yes.
and as I said, feel free
In
to
fact, I'm
demur.
registered independent. I just refuse to be trapped by legal definition. It just dorks me. But that's
But
just
do you miss public service, and would you exclude the possibility of future public office?
what brings this question. No, I would not exclude the possibility, because I always believe you need to listen, because service continues. But I also remind people, look, service takes lots of different forms. You don't have to work in the government to serve society or serve the broader world that we're all part of. Even though don't get me wrong, I took great pride in the fact I did it for 37 years. But but I will tell you, the biggest challenge to me is, guys, we have got to come together as a society and a global community. I mean, what depresses me in some ways, we are in the midst of the greatest global health crisis that we have faced in over a century. And what's the global answer to this? Literally, it seems to be, well, every nation's doing their own thing. I'm like, guys, you can't work global problems like this. You look at our own inability to come together on, you name the issue. Guys, if we can't collaborate together, we both can't solve problems, but we also can't take advantage of opportunity. And we got time now for quantum and other things. The longer we delay some of these big issues, the fewer options we have, the more expensive it gets to deal with the problem. And quite frankly, the harder it is to deal with the problem. So we have got to come together in a lot of different ways. And cyber is a good example of that. I always used to tell people, look, cyber is the ultimate team sport. There is no one single organization. There is no one single public sector, private sector, United States, China, Europe. There's no one single entity that has the answer here. It's about our ability to come together and work this collaboratively, combining the deep technical knowledge that is spread in multiple areas, along with the academic community, along with the business community, along with government and its role in policy and regulatory and legal frameworks, as well as the technical capacity that government has, the knowledge and the insight that the private sector has. But guys, we got to bring this all together. That is my biggest frustration in cybersecurity. Like we still are not integrated enough. I look at Ukraine and go, guys, there's a takeaway from what's happening over there. They have taken a totally integrated approach to this, where they literally have brought together 24/7 private sector, government, civilian. That's what we need to do. And I hope that God, it doesn't take a war to convince us, maybe we need to try something a little differently if we hope to get a different, outcome. That's just my project. We should take questions. Come on.
Yes. Questions from the room. The entire room is mic'd, so just please.
With this crowd, you can't hide. So you cannot hide in this crowd.
You can state your affiliation and.
Mike Lasky with Widelity. So sort of from the title of this session, do you theoretically envision that there will be a bifurcation of influencing entities in the future? Right now, there's sort of the US and its allies, and there's sort of Russia and China, but there are other very aggressive state actors. Do they all form do they all sort of form so that you get two sides to the world problem? There's two set of standards coming. Do Russia and China, Iran, South American entities, the authoritarian regimes all organize? Are they now?
Come on, because I have an opinion, but you guys should chime in.
Yeah, I mean, we refer to it as a digital iron curtain, right? I mean, I think the effort I saw, by China and the ITU to create a new IP standard, right? And let's just say that was successful, right? That they had somehow modified IP in a way that everywhere this new IP were to be built, there would need to be some interface that sits between current, internet protocol and this new thing. And they were successful driving it into all the developing economies that they're participating in now, in addition to their own, right? You would have a digital iron curtain sitting between all the networks that they control, right? From DC to daylight, right? All the way, from wired and wireless PHY all the way up to stack, everywhere they are. And I think that would then, we've already seen, some of these peer adversaries working to modify standards, right? Domestically, to allow their own domestic industry to outcompete international companies that also want to compete in that space. Modification of Wi-Fi as an example, right? To make it easy for their own domestic industries to participate. So it already is happening. There are bigger efforts, or at least have been underfoot, right? To try to build that bifurcation of the standards that would allow for, autocracies to have better population control and all the other types of things you can do, right? With these tools if you have malicious intent.
Can I just add one thing to this? I think almost the bifurcation of the standard almost doesn't matter. The question is this is all about economic competition. So at the end of the day, this is about creating the safe harbor. And so if our adversaries work with, let's say, let's go to Africa, talk about Africa. We're going to start working with some of the emerging nations there. We're going to create a safe harbor. Name your standard. You adhere to this harbor, the safe harbor. We're going to, economic cooperation is absolutely possible. That's the challenge. It's not necessarily the bifurcation. It's the sort of on the floor adoption.
Although I'd only say, look, where you sit really shapes your view here. If you're the Russians, you don't worry about economic competitiveness so much. That is not your number one strategic driver. Your number one strategic driver is your takeaway from this conflict is they want to make sure that they are much less resistant to external pressure in the future, whether that's their economic model, whether that's currency, whether that's a replacement for the SWIFT backbone. Clearly the Russians and the Chinese as well are saying, look, one of the takeaways from this conflict is the authoritarian states in many ways, have got to position themselves to be much more resistant to external pressure so that, hey, the West and the US couldn't do to them in the future what is being done now. Different calculus, if you're in Africa, for example, that's not the primary shaper in calculus for them. I'm not trying to say one is good, one is bad. It's just different. I don't think this is going to be as easy as the authoritarian states think it will be. I just think for a lot of reasons, it's much more complex, but I will say they are working aggressively to minimize the potential of the West and the US to be able to do this in the future to them.
And Laura, you have a thought?
Yeah, I actually wanted to add to this because we've really mentioned a lot about China and Russia and our adversaries, but I would want to point out that we're seeing this bifurcation even with our people that we would consider our friends and the people we're working with. If you look at what's happening in Europe with digital sovereignty, with looking at only creating standards in European standards organizations, or even at the new European standards policy they want to create, where they want to alienate any non-European country, any non-European organizations that are not based in Europe, being able to participate in creating standards. This adds to this idea of we're not coming together. To Mike's point of we're not coming together to address this issue. We're starting to actually see more nationalism and more isolation viewpoints in different regions, where you could end up with a different set of standards that have to be applied in the US, in Europe, in China, in Russia, in Australia, in Japan, etc. And we're focusing so much on just China or just Russia that we're forgetting that even the people who we're supposed to be working with are doing the same thing.
Although
So
remember,
I just kind of want to point that out too.
for the EU, that their view is shaped much more by this concept of what they believe is the morally right thing to do. What they also argue is anti-market and anti-competition, in which security is not a primary shaper for their policy. Their view is, hey, look, we have got to rein big tech in, that the anti-market and anti-competitive practices of tech are hurting the citizens of the EU. I mean, that's their position. The DMA and the DSA are a reflection of that structure. So to me, it's less about that they're trying to wall themselves off, and it's much more they have a different view about what the role of the digital future should be and what role private companies, particularly large US companies, since the largest tend to be US based, not solely, don't want to imply that. But I think to Laura's point though, another point I would make is we have got to stop looking at all these issues in isolation. We look at like, when we're looking at digital technology, we tend to look at a soda straw through, well, how are we going to address anti-competition and anti-competitive concerns? Then we'll use a different straw to say, well, how are we going to address security? And I'm going, guys, we have got to integrate our solutions to these problem sets. In the name of competition, we are actually, the DMA to me, actually potentially undermines security in some elements in the name of in the name of ensuring competition. I'm going, guys, this is not a smart way to go about regulating how we're going to do technology. I'm not trying to minimize the very valid concerns about competitive or monopolistic practices. I'm just trying to say, guys, could we not just focus on this in isolation? Can't we come up with solutions that address those concerns, but are also mindful of the challenges of cybersecurity, for example?
Very good. We are almost at our time here, and I will do my best to synthesize the last question. We have a couple of questions about quantum. That seems one of the takeaways from this is the great interest in the overlap between cyber and quantum and artificial intelligence. But the question is, how long will it take to crack an AES 256 encrypted device? And another one is specifically with respect to Kyndryl. So the Kyndryl related one is, and I don't know the answer to the decryption question, but maybe one of you. Here's the Kyndryl question, because Chris, you're an inventor.
Come on, take it home.
You're an inventor. You are an entrepreneur, an inventor. And one thing that can be said about IBM is that it was also quantum when quantum wasn't cool. And IBM has provided the world with Qiskit, the open source SDK, which is relevant to all flavors of quantum computing, trapped ion, quantum dot, quantum annealing, photonic quantum through Gaussian boson sampling. So IBM, having been prescient in this area, has this resulted in Kyndryl having already thought through some of these challenges and then getting a leg up in helping its clients to address the impact of quantum security?
Yeah, and I think, so I think the market is in its nascent stages and exploring, sort of effective use cases for the use of quantum. I think within the automobile industry and, there's certain industries where we have seen on the ground the application of the technology, to where there is a substantive financial, portfolio analysis, but where you see a real credible outcome associated with technology. And what the challenges that we find as we're sort of exploring the space is, photonic as an example, that seems to be the front runner right now. Okay, that's great, but you still need to, how do you actually code on top of, sort of this infrastructure? Working with Microsoft. Microsoft has, sort of quite a leg up in sort of the development of the app, sort of from an application lifecycle perspective. How do you actually code your algorithms and make them real within? In any case, do we have exposure and experience? Yes, I would say that most organizations like ours, with the exposure and the experience, are still like anyone else, trying to figure out who's going to win, trying to figure out how is it going to be used, trying to figure out how do you bring this to a client in a credible way. Going back to sort of this question about Europe, where the academic institutions are really good is if you look at the University of Darmstadt. Right, they're doing a great job, right? Because what they'll do is they will actually partner with private industry and organizations like ours to create those use cases, bring them to the market so that they are, sort of substantial and credible. So if we want to, create those academic relationships in that space, that's a good thing. But a long story short, yes, we've got a leg up in so much as we've had that practical experience. Are any companies really in the position right now of these large scale, sort of quantum implementations?
We still don't have a clear winner yet. What's the core technology that we're going to build around?
Yeah, I mean, there's some positives, like photonic there's definitely we're beginning to see some, but it's early.
Are you ready to receive your quantum secure analog information storage appliance, official ITI INCITS issue?
He's got several in the bag here.
I'm
to
almost
say that.
terrified. Yeah.
There you go.
Our cybersecurity policy doesn't allow us to plug those into our machines though.
That's right.
Beautiful.
USB port.
Will you please join me in thanking our panelists? If you have any questions about INCITS, we welcome your participation. Lynn Barra, you can contact Lynn about membership. You can reach me. And the website is incits.org. Thank you.